town of Harlan's Bluff, Montana, held what the county called a resettlement exhibition on the second Friday of each month. It was not called what it was. What it was a dispersal, a formal, paper-documented, county-stamped dispersal of people the territory had determined it no longer had adequate provisions for widows, past working age, veterans whose minds had come back from the war rearranged, and the occasional younger person whose circumstances had collapsed in ways that left them without anyone willing to claim them. The county charged a small administrative fee, 10 cents per person, which covered the cost of the ledger and the man who kept it and the rope that cordoned off the presentation area from the crowd. It was 1883 in March, which in Montana meant the snow was still hard-packed in the shadows but beginning to soften in the sun, and the air had the particular smell of cold earth, deciding to reconsider. Josephine Aldred had come to Harlan's Bluff for entirely different reasons. She was 31 years old, which was not young by frontier standards, and which she was aware of in the way a person is aware of a stone in their boot. Not always, but reliably at certain moments. She had a wagon, a mule named Porter, $17 in the leather pouch sewn into the lining of her coat, and a letter of introduction to the pharmacist on Harlan's Bluff's Main Street, who had written to her uncle in February asking if anyone could be found to run the medicine counter 3 days a week while he recovered from a broken ankle. Her uncle had written back with Josephine's name, which was the kind of help that was also, in its own way, a suggestion about what she ought to do next with her life. She had been a schoolteacher in Billings for 4 years. The school had closed when the mining operation at Surd went under. Before that, a wife for 2 years to a man named Samuel Aldred, who had been decent and had died of a chest illness that took him in 6 weeks, which was long enough to understand what was being lost and not long enough to say everything that needed saying. She did not think about Samuel every day anymore, which was its own kind of information. She was tying Porter to the post outside the pharmacist's office when she noticed the crowd gathered in the square. She noticed the man first, a large, deliberate-looking man of perhaps 55, with the kind of face that had been weathered into its permanent expression and showed no sign of reconsidering. He was standing at the edge of the cordon with his hat in both hands, turning it in slow circles the way men do when they are paying attention to something they do not want to appear to be paying attention to. Then she noticed what he was paying attention to. At the end of the resettlement line, past the elderly couples and the bent veteran and the woman with the infant, stood a girl who was not quite a girl. She was perhaps 19 or 20, though she held herself with a stillness that made it difficult to be certain. Small, not fragile small, but the particular smallness of someone who has arranged herself to take up as little space as possible, which is a learned thing and not a natural one. Dark eyes that moved across the crowd with a calculation she was not bothering to conceal. A wool coat that had been mended at both elbows, with thread that did not quite match, which told you something about the resources available and something about the care taken anyway. She was the last one on the line. She had been the last one for 2 hours, which Josephine learned later from the county man. Her name was listed as Agnes Brierly, 20 years old, born in Wisconsin, had come west with a husband who had left her in Harlan's Bluff 8 months prior with no money and no forwarding address, which the county had determined was abandonment and which had resulted through a chain of circumstances involving a boarding house bill and a landlord with no patience. In her presence at the resettlement exhibition, Josephine watched 3 people approach Agnes Brierly and turn away. A rancher's wife who had wanted someone younger, she said, though Agnes was already young. A merchant who wanted a housekeeper and decided after looking at Agnes's hands that she wasn't strong enough, which anyone who looked carefully would have seen was wrong. A couple from the north end of the county who had come for someone who could help with children looked at Agnes and moved on without explanation. Agnes watched each of them go. Her face did not change. This was, Josephine thought, either exceptional composure or the face of someone who had stopped being surprised by this particular outcome and had decided to stop performing surprise for the benefit of others. Josephine was still standing there, Porter's reins in her hand, when the county man, A reedy fellow named Birch with ink on his fingers and the humorless efficiency of someone who processes difficult things by not thinking about them, came to the end of the line and consulted his ledger. He looked at Agnes. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the thinning crowd. Then he looked at Josephine, who was the nearest person and who had, apparently, been standing there long enough to constitute interest. "You lookin'?" Birch said. Josephine was not looking. She had $17 and a letter of introduction and a mule, and no plans that included another person. She looked at Agnes Brierly, who looked back at her with those calculating eyes, and who had, in the entirety of Josephine's observation, shown no fear and no appeal. Only the level assessment of someone taking the measure of an unknown quantity. "What happened to her husband?" Josephine said. Birch checked the ledger, went to Portland, sent one letter, then nothing. "How long has she been waiting?" "Here today?" 2 hours. "In Harlan's Bluff generally?" Birch paused. "Since July." 8 months. 8 months in a town that had apparently not resolved the question of what to do with a young woman the county had determined was a dependent and who had nobody to depend on. 10 cents, Josephine said. 10 cents, Birch confirmed. Josephine reached into her coat, not into the sewn lining, that money was for emergencies, but into the pocket, where she kept smaller amounts. She found a dime. She was not entirely certain, in the moment of handing it over, what she was doing. She had a pharmacist to meet and a job to begin, and a wagon with room for one. She had a mule named Porter who was indifferent to human company. She had $17 and no permanent address and no qualifications for whatever she had just taken on. Agnes Brierly stood beside her while Birch filled out the transfer paperwork. When it was done, Agnes picked up the bag at her feet. It was the size of a loaf of bread. Josephine looked at it and understood immediately that this was everything and that everything was not much. Agnes looked at her, not gratefully, assessingly. "You have a place?" Agnes said. Her voice was flat, not unfriendly, the voice of someone who wants information and has learned to ask for it plainly because elaborate approaches take longer. "Not yet," Josephine said. "I'm starting a job on Monday, 3 days a week at the pharmacy." "What do you do the other 4 days?" "I haven't decided." Agnes looked at Porter, then at the wagon, then at Josephine. "Can you use help?" Agnes said. Not pleading, proposing. Josephine looked at her for a moment. "What kind of help?" "Whatever kind you need," Agnes said. "I can cook, I can read and write. I kept accounts for my husband's supplier for 2 years before he left. I'm good with numbers." A pause. "I'm not good with self-pity. I find it wastes time." Josephine looked at the wagon. She looked at Agnes. She thought about the pharmacist and the broken ankle and the medicine counter and the 4 days a week she had not yet figured out. "All right," she said. They found lodging that afternoon at a boarding house on the east end of Harlan's Bluff, run by a widow named Harriet Fell who charged fair rates and asked no questions that were not directly relevant to whether rent would be paid on time. 2 rooms, small, clean, with a shared stove in the hall. Agnes looked at the room Josephine had taken for her, which contained a cot, a window, and a nail for coats, and said thank you with the precision of someone who means it exactly as much as they say it, and not more. Over supper that first evening, a stew from the boarding house kitchen that was better than expected, Josephine learned that Agnes had grown up in Kenosha, Wisconsin, the daughter of a man who kept books for a textile mill, and a mother who died when Agnes was 9. She had come west at 18 with a man named Gerald Brierly, who had been charming and optimistic and who had understood eventually that optimism requires either luck or effort, and had chosen, when pressed, to relocate rather than supply either. "Were you angry?" Josephine said. "For a while," Agnes said. "Then I was just practical." She ate. Anger takes energy. I needed the energy for other things. "What other things?" Agnes looked at her bowl, figuring out what came next. She looked up. Same as now. Josephine told her own story the way she had learned to tell it, not everything, but the honest shape of it. The school in Billings. The 2 years with Samuel, who had been a good man and not a lucky one. The chest illness, the 6 weeks, The things not said. The uncle's letter, the pharmacist's broken ankle. She had not told this to anyone in the particular sequence that made it a complete accounting. She was not sure why she was telling it now, to a 20-year-old in a boarding house in Harlan's Bluff, Montana, over a stew she hadn't cooked. Agnes listened without interrupting. When Josephine was done, she was quiet for a moment. "How long ago did he die?" she said. 3 years. "Do you still think about him?" Josephine considered the honest answer. "Less than I used to. Sometimes that feels like progress, and sometimes it feels like something else." Agnes nodded, the nod of someone who understands that certain losses don't resolve, they only rearrange. "My mother," Agnes said. "I was 9. You think at 9 you'll remember everything. You remember less than you think you will. And then some days you remember a thing so clearly it's like she's in the room." She paused. "The way she organized her buttons by color, I don't know why that's what stayed." Josephine said nothing to that because nothing needed saying. They were quiet for a while after, the particular quiet of two people who have told the truth and found it was not dangerous. The pharmacy job was steady. The pharmacist, a man named Octavius Brent, whose ankle was healing imperfectly and who was consequently in a constant mild irritation with everything, turned out to be a precise and knowledgeable teacher who insisted on accuracy and explained his reasons, which Josephine respected. She learned the stock, the measures, the record-keeping system, and the particular art of dealing with customers who came in for remedies but needed, more often, to talk to someone who would listen without charging them for it. Agnes, meanwhile, had made herself useful in ways that Josephine had not anticipated and had not asked for. She had taken over the wagon's accounts. Josephine had been keeping them in her head, which worked until it didn't, and produced a written ledger within the first week that was cleaner and more detailed than anything Josephine had managed. She had also, without discussion, determined that the boarding house was charging them 2 cents above the fair rate for the hall stove, and had negotiated with Harriet Fell in a conversation that Josephine was not present for, and that had resulted in a reduction and, apparently, in Harriet's increased respect for Agnes, because she began leaving extra biscuits outside their doors on Thursdays. "How did you manage that?" Josephine asked. "I told her the truth," Agnes said. "People respond well to accurate information delivered without accusation." She hadn't noticed she was overcharging. She was grateful to know. Josephine looked at her. "Where did you learn that?" Agnes thought about it. "My father kept accounts. He said the best negotiation is one where both people leave thinking they were right." She paused. Gerald didn't believe that. He thought negotiation was about winning. Another pause. "He lost a great deal." The trouble came from a man named Doyle Prentice. Prentice ran the largest freighting operation in the county, which gave him an opinion about most things and the habit of expressing it. He was not a bad man, in the way that some men are straightforwardly bad, but he was the particular kind of man who has been given authority in one domain and has concluded that authority is a general condition rather than a specific grant. He had decided, in the particular way of men who decide things about women without consulting them, that Agnes Brierly was a problem that needed managing. He came to the boarding house on a Tuesday, which Josephine was at the pharmacy for. Agnes was in their shared sitting area, working on the accounts, when Prentice arrived and informed Harriet Fell, loudly enough to be heard through the wall, that the young abandoned woman on the second floor was a liability to the respectable character of the establishment, and that it would be better for everyone if she found different arrangements. Harriet Fell, who had her own opinions, told him that her establishment's character was her business and not his, and that he was welcome to take his concerns to the county ledger where they would be filed and forgotten, which was, Josephine thought when she heard about it later, a magnificent response. Prentice left. Agnes had continued doing the accounts throughout. Josephine found out from Brent, the pharmacist, who had heard from his wife, who had been walking past the boarding house and had heard the whole thing through the window. She came home that evening and found Agnes at the stove in the hall, heating water with the focused attention she gave all tasks. "I heard about Prentice," Josephine said. "It's nothing," Agnes said. "It's not nothing. It's not new, Agnes said. Since Gerald left, people have had opinions about what I represent. A woman alone is either a problem or a warning, depending on who's looking. She poured the water. I've stopped trying to be neither. I'm just a person. What they make of that is their work, not mine. Josephine stood in the doorway. Does it bother you? Agnes thought about it with the same seriousness she applied to everything. It used to make me feel like I'd done something wrong, she said. Like if I'd been different, made better choices, managed Gerald better, it wouldn't have happened. She set down the kettle. Now I know that's not right. Gerald made his choices. Prentice has his opinions. Neither of those things is about me, even when they're directed at me. Josephine looked at her for a long moment. That's a hard thing to get to, she said. It took 8 months in a town where nobody knew me, Agnes said. When you have no reputation, you find out what's actually underneath it. She almost smiled. Not quite, but the direction of one. It turns out I'm competent and I have strong opinions about ledger formatting. That's not so bad. Josephine had not intended to do anything about Prentice. Agnes had specifically said not to. But she had occasion the following week to speak with the man who owned the building Prentice operated his freight office from, who was also a patient of Brent's pharmacy and who came in on Thursdays for his tincture. She did not threaten anything, and she did not make accusations. She simply mentioned, in the course of a conversation about the general character of the town's commercial district, that she had found the boarding house on Eastwick Street to be a well-run and respectable establishment, and that she had noticed some confusion about this among certain parties who might benefit from better information. The building owner, who was a practical man, understood her completely. Prentice had a different sort of week shortly after. Agnes never knew why, or if she did, she didn't say. By April, the pharmacist's ankle had improved enough that he offered Josephine a 4th day, and then a 5th, and then a permanent position with a salary that was not large but was reliable. He said she had a way with the customers that he did not, specifically the ones who needed to talk. He said this somewhat grudgingly because Octavia Sprent gave compliments the way a man pays a debt he resents, accurately but without enthusiasm. Josephine said she would think about it. She was thinking about several things at once that required thought. She had $17 still, minus what she'd spent in 6 weeks, which was less than she'd feared because Agnes's accounting had introduced certain efficiencies. She had a reliable income. She had a mule and a wagon, and no plan for what came after winter. She had Agnes Brierly, who had been in the next room for 6 weeks and who had, without any explicit arrangement, become the person Josephine looked for when she came home. It was a Friday evening in April when she found Agnes in their sitting room, reading. She had gone through Josephine's 3 books and acquired 2 more from somewhere, which Josephine had decided not to ask about. With a concentration that blocked out everything except what required attention. Agnes, Josephine said. Agnes looked up. I need to say something. All right, Agnes said. She set the book down. This was one of her consistent qualities. When something required full attention, she gave it full attention and did not pretend otherwise. I'm going to take the permanent position, Josephine said, which means staying in Harlan's Bluff. It means a real address and a real salary and something that looks more fixed than what I've had. Agnes nodded, listening. I've been thinking, Josephine said, about what that means for the other question. The question of what the arrangement is between us. She looked at the window. You've been keeping my accounts and negotiating my rent and finding efficiencies I didn't know existed. I have been paying you nothing and calling it room and board, which is not the same as fair. I haven't asked for anything different, Agnes said. I know. That's the part I keep thinking about. Josephine turned back to her. You're 20 years old, and you're the best administrator I've ever encountered. You handled Prentice without flinching. You learned Brent's entire stock system from asking him one question and reading his labels. A pause. I would like, if you're willing, to make this something real. A real partnership. Salary, equal say in decisions. And, if you wanted it, a proper legal arrangement, Something on paper, so that what you have doesn't depend on my continued goodwill." Agnes looked at her, the processing expression still and thorough. "What kind of legal arrangement?" she said. "I'm not certain of the exact form, but there are instruments, I've asked Brent, who knows the county clerk, that would give you standing. Something that could not be revoked without your agreement." "Why?" Agnes said. Not defensively, she wanted the reason. Josephine thought about the honest answer. "Because I stopped in that square for a reason I understood immediately and didn't want to examine too closely," she said. "And because you've been the most capable person I've been around since Samuel, and Samuel was very capable. And because—" she paused, "because you deserve to have something that's yours, not borrowed, not contingent, yours." She looked at the window again. "And because I think we've been doing something that works these last 6 weeks, and I'd like it to be intentional rather than accidental." Agnes was quiet for a long time, long enough that Josephine began to think she had miscalculated. Then Agnes said, "I would want that." The county clerk processed the partnership papers with less ceremony than Josephine had expected and more thoroughness than she had hoped, which took 3 weeks and required 2 notarized statements and an afternoon that neither of them particularly wanted to repeat. But it was done. Brent, when told, said good and returned to his inventory, which was his version of enthusiasm. Harriet Fell made a cake. The cake was dense and aggressively sweet and was eaten completely. Agnes Brierly turned out to have a gift for systems that were invisible until you removed them. She reorganized the pharmacy's supply ordering in the first month of their formal arrangement, reducing the delivery delays by 1/3. She took on the accounts of 2 neighboring businesses on a consulting basis, which brought in enough additional income to cover a larger wagon, which Porter took personally and was eventually persuaded to accept. She had opinions about everything and expressed them in the precise, low-key way of someone who has learned that accuracy is more effective than volume. She grew into the arrangement the way a person grows into a thing that fits them, not with dramatic transformation, but with the gradual relaxation of someone who has found the correct size. She stopped scanning rooms for exits with quite so much regularity. She started a correspondence with a county school, which was looking for someone to run an adult literacy class 2 evenings a week, and began it without asking permission, then told Josephine, who said she should have consulted her first, and Agnes said she had been about to, which was true by a margin of about 4 hours. There was a woman in town, a cattleman's wife with time and certainty in equal measure, who made a remark at the dry goods store one October afternoon, something about the nature of the arrangement between 2 unmarried women sharing rooms and finances, said in the particular tone that is designed to be overheard. Agnes heard it. Josephine, who was 2 miles away, heard it also. She went to find Agnes. Agnes was examining flour prices with total composure. "I heard," Josephine said. "I know," Agnes said. "Are you all right?" Agnes set down the flour sack and looked at Josephine directly. "People who don't know what they're looking at make up a story to fill the gap," she said. "What we have is a legal partnership and a set of shared accounts and a mule named Porter who dislikes change. Anyone who wants to make that into something scandalous is working very hard to find scandal in arithmetic." Josephine looked at her. "That's remarkably reasonable." "I've had practice," Agnes said. She picked up the flour sack. "She also underpays her house girl by 40 cents a week, which I happen to know because the house girl does her banking on Thursdays and I've seen the figures, so her opinion of correct arrangements carries limited weight." Josephine looked at the flour sack, then at Agnes. Then she did something she had not done in longer than she could accurately remember. She laughed. Fully actually laughed, the kind that comes without warning and does not stop at once. Agnes almost smiled, then actually smiled, the quick, real smile that reorganized her face into something younger and less defended, and that appeared rarely enough to be worth noticing every time. Josephine took the permanent position. The arrangement remained. Agnes's consulting work expanded until it was no longer supplementary, but its own substantial thing. 3 businesses, then 5, then a standing relationship with the county land office, which had been keeping its transfer records in a way that was technically legal and practically incomprehensible, and which Agnes reorganized over the course of a winter, into something that the county clerk described as the best record system in the territory, which was not an exaggeration. She bought land. Not much, to start, a quarter-acre on the edge of town, but she bought it herself with money she had earned and accounted for under her own name in a county where her name had once appeared only in a ledger under the heading of resettlement. She told Josephine about the land on a November evening, sitting by the stove in their larger rooms. They had moved to a proper apartment above the pharmacy, which Brent had offered at a rate that made financial sense for everyone and which had the additional advantage of stopping the commute in the snow. "I'm not surprised," Josephine said. "You're not?" "I stopped being surprised by you somewhere around the third Thursday." Agnes almost smiled, then fully smiled. "What happened on the third Thursday?" "You renegotiated Brent's supply contract without being asked," Josephine said. "He was annoyed for a day, and then he admitted you'd saved him $14 a month. He's never mentioned it again because Brent doesn't believe in gratitude, but he told me privately." Agnes looked at the stove. $14.30, she said. "Of course you know the exact number." "I know all the numbers," Agnes said. "That's the work." There was a pause, comfortable in the way that some silences between people who know each other well become comfortable, not empty, just settled. "Agnes," Josephine said. "Yes." "Are you glad," Josephine said, "that I stopped in that square?" Agnes was quiet for a moment. She looked at the stove with the same focused attention she gave everything, which meant she was not deflecting the question, just taking it seriously. "I've thought about what would have happened otherwise," she said, "if you had walked past. If Birch had found someone else or found no one." She paused. "I think I would have managed. I've managed things before." Another pause. "But I think managed is not the same as this." She looked up. "This is different." "Different how?" Agnes looked at her with the same dark, assessing eyes that had taken stock of her on a March afternoon in a Montana square with 6 inches of old snow on the ground. "You stopped," Agnes said, "because you couldn't walk past. And I know that's true because I've seen you walk past 100 things that were not your problem. You don't stop for everything. You stopped for that." A pause. "That's not manageable. That's not something I would have found somewhere else. You can't account for that in a ledger." Josephine looked at the stove for a while. "No," she said, "you can't." They sat in the quiet that follows true things, the warm stove making its small sounds, Porter presumably indifferent in the stable below, the last of the November light going thin at the window. Josephine Aldred had come to Harlan's Bluff with $17, a mule, and a letter of introduction to a pharmacist with a broken ankle. She had spent a dime in a town square on a cold Friday in March and had not, since that moment, been entirely certain what she had started, only that it had turned out to be the right thing. Not a charity, not a rescue, a dime and a question, and a young woman with a bag the size of a loaf of bread and the steadiest eyes she had ever seen, who had turned out to be the most important accountant, advocate, and friend she had found in 31 years of looking, though she had not known she was looking. Found for a dime on a hard Montana morning, worth considerably more than any ledger she had ever balanced. I keep thinking about the bag. Agnes Brierly's bag was the size of a loaf of bread. That was everything she had after 20 years of living and 2 years of marriage and 8 months of waiting in a town that had decided she was a problem to be processed, a loaf of bread's worth of belongings. And she picked it up without complaint, without drama, and asked a practical question. "Do you have a place?" That's the part that stays with me. Not the hardship. Plenty of people have had it hard and come out bitter or broken. What stays with me is the clarity. Agnes didn't waste a single word on what had been done to her. She looked at what was in front of her and asked what was useful. I think about what produced that in her. Her father taught her that honest information, delivered without accusation, gets better results than anger. She internalized it not as a rule, but as a way of moving through the world. That's the thing about real character. It doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from someone, somewhere, having the patience to model it. Her father gave her that. She built the rest herself. And she did build it. When Gerald left and the money was gone and the landlord had no patience, Agnes didn't collapse into the story of what had been taken from her. She stayed upright. She kept her accounting precise. She negotiated with the landlord and came away with a reduction in the landlord's respect. She faced Doyle Prentice and didn't flinch, not because she wasn't affected, but because she had long ago decided that other people's misreading of her was their work, not hers. That kind of steadiness doesn't come from luck. It comes from deciding over and over, in small moments nobody sees, to stay accurate about who you are, even when the world around you is inaccurate about it. That's what I'd call real grit. Not the loud kind, not the kind that announces itself, the quiet, daily, unremarkable kind that just keeps showing up. What Josephine brought was different. She had intelligence and judgment and the particular skill of knowing when a situation is not what it's being called. She walked past a county exhibition and saw a person, not a problem. She spent a dime, not because she had extra to spend, but because she couldn't make the accounting work any other way. The cost of walking past was higher than the cost of stopping. That's a kind of moral reasoning that doesn't require a framework or a doctrine. It just requires paying attention to what's actually in front of you. The two of them together produce something neither would have produced alone: Josephine's judgment and Agnes's systems. Agnes's precision and Josephine's instinct for people. The legal partnership was just paper. The real arrangement had already been established in 6 weeks of shared stoves and honest suppers and a dime that turned out to be the most precisely spent coin in Harlan's Bluff's recorded history. What I take from it is this: the life you're looking for is sometimes found in the thing you almost walked past. The person who changes everything sometimes arrives with a bag the size of a loaf of bread and the steadiest eyes you've ever seen. And the question isn't whether you were ready for them. The question is whether you were paying enough attention to stop. Josephine was. That made all the difference. Not luck, not fate. A woman who was paying attention and who had the decency to act on what she saw.